Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back. In our lecture 5 of our course on Introduction to Family in Kinship India, we are discussing the joint family in India. You must understand that the study of kinship and family in India is differently oriented. Within the anthropology of kinship, the study of the family occupies a very minimal role. The conceptualization of the family traditionally and within academia has been in the area of sociology. So, the important thing to remember is that when we distinguish between social anthropology and sociology, the tools of methodology and the way in which the study of these two sets is considered becomes very important. Therefore, family becomes something that has to be looked at in a sociological sense. Most of the studies on the family are conducted through survey research methods and not through the anthropological method of the ethnography. Of course, this is now fast changing, as we'll see, but the study of the family becomes a way in which you map family trends and not look at particular communities and how they practice kinship. Kinship, as we have discussed till now, has varied ideas attached to it. The family becomes restricted to the idea of co-residence, of the household, and how members of a small unit come together. In the study of India and in the sociology of India, as Patricia Oberoi notes, traditionally the idea of the Indian joint family has been very, very important. Henry Maine, one of the colonial administrators who mapped the idea of Indian society, the village and the family, the joint family, were two things in India that would never change. For Maine, the system, the village republic, was a self-sufficient system that existed and would exist through eternity in India. The whole bulwark and foundation of India was based on this idea of the village republic, which, as you later know, Gandhi also used in his idea of a nation that was built around the village republic. However, in looking at the joint family, besides the village, the joint family becomes the subunit within the village, which creates an idea of Indian nationhood as well. The joint family in India remains unchanged and eternal. However, in trying to think of this idea of whether the joint family remains unchanged and eternal, we have to also understand what makes the joint family in India. What is it that the Indian joint family consists of? We need to understand the conceptualization of the joint family first and foremost to be able to decide whether it has an unchanging character or not. In the sociology of India in the early 50s, 60s and 70s, this question of the joint family remained the most predominant source of inquiry. Many sociologists, including A.R. Desai, I.P. Desai, A.M. Shah and others, looked at the idea of the joint family. The joint family in itself is a very complicated idea. How do we identify this particular social group? Is it to be identified in terms of number of family members? Is it to be understood in terms of who all live together? It is to be understood in terms of shared property? Is it to be understood in terms of shared identity? What is the paradox of the joint family in India? One of the perennial questions within Indian sociology, since it became a discipline in its own right, has been the question of whether the Indian joint family is slowly disintegrating. This question was largely provoked by the idea that with the coming in of westernization, urbanization and other social processes, the Indian joint family will slowly fall apart and give way to the Western ideal of the nuclear family. The nuclear family being parents and children, small units of togetherness. However, this contention that the Indian joint family is disintegrating was for most part of the last century a very important academic question. It marked our understanding of India itself. people in India will refuse to believe that the Indian joint family is on its way out. For a long time that was true. Today, however, we try to understand whether the Indian joint family is already extinct or not. In recent studies, the Indian joint family seems to have resurrected itself in new and novel forms. We will see how that has happened, but first and foremost, this lecture focuses on the idea of the Indian joint family and whether it disintegrates or stays on. This, in essence, is a notion of family within the study of kinship. To begin with, I.P. Desai thinks of how we can conceptualize the idea of the Indian joint family. He looks at Census Commissioner's identification of the joint family in early 1950s census reports, and he finds certain overwhelming criteria being used by the Census Commissioner to identify whether a family is nuclear or joint. What are these criteria? The first is that of family members, 3 or more family members consisting of, family members up to 3 being identified as nuclear. Family members of 4 to 6 being identified as a medium-sized family. Family members of 7 to 9 being identified as larger families, and families of 10 or more being identified as the large joint family. For I.P. Desai, this form of identification of the joint family is not appropriate. The size of people living together within the same place or property does not identify joint family togetherness. What for I.P. Desai should be the most important identification of the joint family is the relationship that people share within a unit. For him, this relationship can have many forms and permutations. He identifies 4 very important criteria to look at the joint family in India. The first is that of common property and income. The second, that of co-residence. The third, that of commensality or togetherness in eating, in living together and playing together, etc. And the fourth is co-worship and performance of certain rights and obligations. For the Hindu and Muslim joint family and the Christian joint family in India, co-worship becomes a very important part of exercising togetherness. When you worship together, you also share certain ideas of rights and obligations that family members should have within a familial setup. Rights and obligations are a very grey area, but largely can be thought of in terms of sharing money, coming in times of aid, for instance, medical help, health issues, etc., or supporting in the care of children. These are some of the rights and obligations that families share. But these are important markers of what makes or breaks a family. Kin cannot all be living together, but they may share things together separately as well, which makes a joint family. And this is critical to our understanding of the joint family in India. Based on these criteria, I.P. Desai looks at how there can be 5 different types of family configurations based on very important 5 criteria. The first, that of kinship, which would include rights and obligations, the type of relationship the people share in the family, eating together, talking together, going to festivals together, co-worship. Second is the generation depth. How many generations are living together, or how many generations stay in touch? This is very critical to the idea of the joint family. Our image of the joint family includes the grandparent and his children and his many children. There may be many grandparents as well living together. The generation depth is not only in terms of a linear generation linkage, but also in terms of a lateral generation linkage, who all are linked to each other in the same generation, right? So the generation depth is followed by the third and the fourth criteria, which is of essential importance in identifying a joint family, that of property and income. Is there shared property? Is there shared income? Is there a pool of income that family members contribute to actually develop the idea of the joint family? The fifth most important idea is that of mutual cooperation. Mutual cooperation can take many forms, but ultimately has within it the idea of how members of a joint family are linked to each other, how they feel obligated to help each other, or what is the idea of togetherness that operates within a joint family. Here I would like to remind you of very well known films in the 80s which focus primarily on the joint family. Hindi cinema during the 1980s was in many ways representative of the declining importance of the joint family, where many film plots explored the idea of how the joint family eventually falls apart. But every joint family pictured in these films actually showed the togetherness of the family as being essential to its continued existence. In most films, the senior generation of grandparents and parents wish to hold on to their children and a joint partnership and living arrangement, whereas the children wanted to break away. This is critical in terms of how wives, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law operated in the joint family setup. Continuing with I.P. Desai's formulation of the joint family, it becomes important to look at how he ultimately identifies 5 types of different familial setups. Between the first and the 5th type, there are 3 very important types of family. The first type of family that I.P. Desai identifies is the nuclear family, which consists of primarily 3 sets of permutations. 2 permutations. The first is that of group of parents living with unmarried children, and the second is that of husband and wife and unmarried children living together. Now, in both these sets, the idea is of a nuclear household. They share both a sense of togetherness, property, and rights and obligations. But they are in many ways a nuclear setup with, whether we like it or not, the consideration of size being taken in, which I.P. Desai had earlier criticized the Census Commissioner about. But there is also a permutation combination. So while in one, there may be a group of parents, the other one has only the husband and wife and unmarried children. This sort of an idea can also be linked to the joint family, but is in essence being portrayed as a nuclear family. This and the 5th type have very interesting linkages. So the 5th type of family that I.P. Desai identifies is actually the joint family in its purest form. Within this, there is greater generational depth. So there are at least 3 or more generations living together, and they all share property together. They not only live together, they share property together, they may share income together, and they have more rights and obligations that they share amongst themselves, giving the family in many sense a greater depth in its configuration and characterization. So the 5th type of family that I.P. Desai identifies is in more ways a model joint family setup, and it requires a greater generational depth. It requires more generations to live together and share in economy and in relationships to be identified as the joint family. Between the 1st and the 5th type of the family, there are 3 more types. The second type of the family, which I.P. Desai identifies, is a nuclear family, which may be existing as a limb of the joint family. Now, please remember type 1 and type 5. Type 1 is the nuclear family and type 5 is the joint family. And between this, the second type of family that Desai identifies is one which is actually a type of the first existing in relation to a family of the 5th type. So there may be a nuclear unit of husband, wife and children who may exist in relation to and in contact with the 5th type. This may happen in varied forms. Maybe this nuclear type exists and lives together in a city or urban area, while the joint family still lives in rural areas. This is a very common type in India. And in many ways, these 2 sets of people share in, let's say, property, income. They may share in rights and obligations also. The only thing that differentiates them from the joint and the nuclear per se is the fact that they don't live together. Co-residence is not mandatory in this case, but just because they are not residing together doesn't mean they are not part of a familial setup. They may still be very much linked to the mother family, which is the joint family. The third type of family that Desai identifies is a nuclear household which is linked to another household. either nuclear or joint in terms of rights and obligations, but no property linkages. This is interesting because if we think of a joint family that might split into many households and many nuclear households, each might actually be linked together in these ties of shared rights and obligations, whereas they might have their own income and property. This is actually a very modern urban form of familial existence in India, where many kin still continue to be linked to each other despite living separately and having different sources of income through the exchange of marriage rituals, co-worship, gift giving. There may be different forms in which they come together. I can give you an example of how 3 brothers living in 3 different cities and having 3 different sources of income may still be linked to each other through particular ideas of supporting aged parents or investing in property together, or just helping each other out in terms of certain events of crisis. This happens regularly in many families in India. They may not fall strictly in the category of the joint type 5 or strictly in the category of type 1, which is a nuclear household, but might be an amalgamation of different rights and duties coming together and identifying themselves as a family. That does not necessarily mean that they are not a family. The last type before type 5, the type 4th family, actually consists of 2 different permutations again. The first one is that of a father or mother, a widowed father, widowed mother, living with a married son or daughter with or without children. Now, this is a form which has become rather common in urban India, where married children live with their widowed parents, single elderly parents taking care of them. They may have children, they may not have children. It shows a generational depth of 3 generations, but there is no depth to each generation, meaning it's not that a number of grandparents live together or a number of married young siblings live together or a number of grandchildren live together. It's primarily one representative of each generation living together in the same household and sharing in property and rights and duties. The other form of the 4th type of family is where the father and the mother live with married sons without children, but have property and income in common. This is also a very common permutation found in India, where parents, again widowed or not widowed, live with their sons in particular who are married, because as we can see from the North Indian example, girls are married out, so they go and live with their husband's family. They live with their sons who may not have children but do have property and income together. This might stem from having property that is going to be passed down to those sons, and therefore they live together. And Desai's examples of these family types are taken from a very strict sociological method of the survey research. He maps families in Saurashtra and does a quantitative analysis of what each family configuration can be like. This is particular in the way in which we map familial size and content. So it is not just size that matters, but it is the way in which the family is configured that brings forth nuance. And it also brings out the further question of whether we should be looking at the question of the disintegration of the joint family in India or not. Is that a pertinent question to ask when we do not have a sense of the ideal joint family yet? Let me give you an interesting example, a slightly macabre example of the joint family. Recently, in a case in Delhi, in the outskirts of Delhi, a family committed suicide together in a place called Dadri. In a horrific story of supernatural influence and superstitious beliefs, a family with a 3-generation depth committed suicide together in a sense of togetherness which is deeply unheard of anywhere in the world, let alone in India. The family went ahead and committed mass suicide following the familial head and his orders. We tend to think about the family in very different ways, but one of the ways in which we do not think about the family is emotionally. In many ways, sociology falls short of looking at the emotional links that a family might have. As mentioned earlier, sociology in its methodology and its construction of the family is embedded in the idea of a survey research method that kind of falls back on quantitative analysis. Within quantitative analysis, mapping emotions becomes very difficult, but emotions are a very important part of looking at why people live together or what binds them together, this sense of we feeling. Togetherness or living together cannot only be dependent on property and income, but might be through a sense of love, affection, and just plain togetherness. This is where anthropology steps in. However, for our analysis here, we continue with this debate on what is ultimately the joint family in India. Therefore, in an earlier article again, the American sociologist Nimkoff is very intrigued with the question of whether the joint family in India is disintegrating. He is actually studying popular perceptions and wants to understand what is the makeup of this joint family in India, which people fear is disintegrating under the influence of urbanization and westernization. He looks at the American family, which he finds is based primarily on ideas of romance, love and affection, and sees how that might negatively mark the ways in which the Indian family is understood. Thus, for Nimkoff, there are two ways in which families are primarily separated. The first is the family of procreation, or the family in which the ego was born, and the second is the family of orientation, or in which the family grows up. I apologize. The family of procreation is the family that the ego sets up on marriage. I apologize for this mistake. But the family of orientation is where the ego is born and grows up. It is these two sets of families that mark American familial systems. So in America, for instance, the family of orientation and the family of procreation are separate. The ego is expected to move out of the family of orientation to set up his or her own familial unit, which is also identified as the conjugal family. Interestingly, in India, this separation does not happen, and Nimkoff is trying to pursue this process and thought of, why is it that the family of procreation and orientation remains together and does not change over a period of time, or the threat of its change is so difficult to understand within the Indian milieu. He finds certain overarching ideologies working in understanding why this disintegration is problematic for the Indian society and our understanding of familial ties. For him, it is important to understand that migration, education, legal legislation, social legislation, and women's role in the family have the potential to change the traditional setup. What are these ideas? Now, for instance, in case of migration, it is very possible that men move out of the family to work elsewhere within the country, outside the village, or outside the country as well. This may lead to a change in the familial structure. This may lead to the ways in which the joint household or family is imagined, or how the power structure operates within it. Similarly, migration may also mean that the man who is moving out to work may take his family out with him, therefore leading to a disintegration. He may just take his wife and children with him to wherever he is working, leading to a disintegration of the earlier joint household with generational depth and commensality. Similarly, what is of interest in Nimkoff's study is how once women start working or are economically employed, their role in the family also changes. Women become more agential, they start taking more household decisions, and that has an impact on the way in which the joint household or the joint family is formed, because women have their own sense of self which comes to mark the family in particular ways. We have to understand how women also essentially think of the familial setup. The moment they start working, it brings in additional pressures within the patrilineal system for women to continue to operate and support the domestic domain. As mentioned earlier in one of the lectures before, the separation of the domestic from the public domain has meant that women are relegated to the domestic domain while men are concentrated in the public domain. It has also meant that while some women make the transition to the public domain, they must continue to adhere to the roles to their roles in the domestic domain. This means additional pressure for the joint family despite having members living within it. We have to understand how this sort of a system works to place its members properly. Nimkov thinks this is a major threat to the way in which the family evolves or constructs itself. Similarly, social legislation, for instance, the one that allowed Hindu women to inherit from their father's property, something that was not allowed earlier traditionally in customary law, means that familial property undergoes its own change. Thus, if separation and secession from the joint household is when men partition and take their portions out of the joint household property, if women start taking their portions, there would be additional stress on the joint property household. This is also interesting because women in North India, as per the patrilineal system, marry out of the joint household into another family, taking a part of the joint household's property that belongs to her father means that that property now gets transferred to another household and family. The permutations and combinations here are characteristic of the kind of stress that traditional structures face when suddenly faced with contemporary current changes. And contemporary current changes have a huge impact on the way in which society constructs its mode of being. Finally, Nimkov looks at the impact of education. He finds that educational systems, especially if they link the ways in which young children are taught about certain ideas such as westernization and urbanization, which are primarily theoretical ideas of individualism and selfhood, the impact on the joint family is bound to happen. This is linked to the notion that the joint family is ultimately a communal body which lives together and eats together and thinks together. Any notion of individualism, when it enters the sense of this kind of setup, is bound to lead to its disintegration. Nimkov thinks that the questions regarding the disintegration of the joint family are important questions that Indians are asking about the role of change and transition to the ways in which people live and think about themselves. This is critical to how we think of ourselves, of being, of our own selves, and how we construct our idea of selfhood and community. But we are not still at an end about thinking about the joint family. Interestingly, in 1975, A. Khatri writes and conceptualizes the idea of the adaptive extended family, which is an interesting node to think of the joint family in India. He thinks, and he finds this in particular, as you can see from the features of the Indian joint family here. Khatri's idea of the ideal joint family has the following features. First feature is that of marriage as a sacrament and a religious and social duty. The second is that of familial responsibility for segregation of marriage in the context of sex segregation. Third is the idea of caste endogamy. Fourth is the idea of the indissolubility, of marriage. Fifth is that of patrilocal residence. Sixth is the domination of parent-child over husband-wife relations. And seventh is that of the newly married couple having less freedom and more surveillance. Eighth is the premium placed on the reproduction of sons. Ninth is the common residence that the family share. 10th is the common property that the family share. 11th is the co-residence of patrilineally related men and their spouses. 12th is the common purse. 13th is the dominance of the male head on family decisions. These are all ideas that are important to thinking about the ideal joint family in India. We have already discussed many of these ideas in terms of looking at kinship itself. But most important, if you look at these features, are how marriage forms a bulk of these ideas. Marriage and its construction within the joint family becomes important. So, for instance, the first, the second, the third, fourth, sixth, seventh. 7 out of 13 features are expressly focused on the idea of marriage and how marriage is a familial duty that is completely organized and oriented by the joint family. The rest of it has to do with economics, so common residence, property, purse, and many of them have to do with the identity and patrilineage through men, so patrilocal residence, reproduction of sons, patrilineally related men, and dominance of male head on family decisions. This points to the idea of how the joint family in many ways thinks of and constructs itself based on three key ideas: marriage, the idea of men as the primary members, and third, economics or joint income or property. Now this is interesting because it is different from what I.P. Desai and Nimkoff have been discussing. I.P. Desai has looked at the economics of the joint family and the composition, but he does shy away from the gender composition of the family, the fact that the joint family in India is essentially a male unit. If you remember from our lecture the other day on how matrilineal systems work together, they too, in Kerala especially, the Nayars worked as a joint household, but the primary membership there belonged to women. However, having said that, they shared one common thing with the patrilineal household: the head of the household is always male. Thus, the whole symbol of authority and power within a household and a joint family comes to be rested on men. Men decide the economics of the family and the members who will come in and go. It becomes important for such a familial unit, therefore, to depend largely on a marriage system where residence comes to be of those who can come in and stay on, and of those who can be sent out. The only members who can be fluid in that sense are women again. In that sense, Khatri's study of the joint family leads him to look at how the Indian joint family is a particular type. In many ways, he tries to do a comparison with the American family as well, and finds similar ideas of individualism coming forth and collectivism coming through in the Indian joint family. When thinking about the adaptive extended family, Khatri identifies three very important characteristics. The first is that where the adaptive extended family always arranges for the marriage of its kin. The marriage of its members is an important role that the adaptive extended family plays. If you remember correctly, the adapted extended, the joint family in how Khatri represents it as an adaptive extended family is very deeply invested in its members' reproduction. Thus, the members should be married correctly to bring forth newer members. Now, this is something that the matrilineal joint family is also interested in. So, it is particular that the joint family invest in the marriage of their children. They must arrange them and they must organize them. That makes up for that sharing. So, the adaptive extended family, according to Khatri, is deeply dependent on the marriage of its members and the arranging of these marriages. Secondly, the adaptive extended family is also very tolerant of other families that may be breaking away from living together, but still continue to be in relationship with them. This is important because, as we discussed in I.P. Desai's formulation of the 5 types of family, there is always the nuclear household that may live separately but continues to be a connected limb of the joint family. This means that the joint family has to be invested in these smaller units that may not live with them but have a greater role to play in their proliferation and in the investment of the family's character. This is important because the adaptive extended family is adaptive because it can take in these separate units into its larger fold. Thus, the last and third type of the adaptive extended family means that it does not act as a barrier to urbanization and industrialization. In fact, it may also facilitate growth and progress within the family. Khatri takes examples of prominent business families which operate as joint familial units and do business together. In India today, we have many such families. Traditionally, the Tatas and the Birlas have been familial businesses. Similarly, Reliance Industries has been a familial business. These are families working together and living together to bring forth more nuanced ideas of industrialization and urbanization. Unlike ideas discussed earlier, urbanization and industrialization may not actually be impediments to the joint family in India, but may actually facilitate its growth, while at the same time the joint family in India might also contribute to the progression of urbanization and industrialization. This is particularly important to understand that the idea of disintegration itself is very fluid and not as black and white as we think it should be. The joint family in India is neither something that exists in status quo, nor is it something that's completely disintegrating. It is actually taking different forms and ideas. It is in this regard that Khatri actually looks at the progression of two kinds of trends in family structure. So, within the American family, and within the Indian family. So, in the past, the American family was distinguished to be a farm agricultural unit and the Indian family was identified as the Indian joint family, which we are still trying to define but can loosely understand as a depth of generations living together and sharing in property and income. In the present, the farm agricultural family of the American society has changed into the conjugal unit, consisting of husband, wife and children. But the Indian joint family has divided into three forms. The first is the adaptive extended family, or what Khatri calls AEF. The second is the conjugal family on the lines of the American family, and the third is the joint family. None of these exist in particular definitional forms. They may all have different varieties and permutations as we are seeing, but the Indian joint family itself is not stuck in time or in one particular form, but has disintegrated into many forms which collapse into each other and form newer forms. The future of the family in many ways is going to be different. According to Khatri, the family formation in America and India can take very different forms. But ultimately what he suggests is that there will be a fragile formation of the family and the process it takes towards its own fulfillment. This can be negotiated in the future and something that we are not sure of, but will definitely have its own formations and permutations. Therefore, moving beyond just looking at the joint family in India, one must look at how the family interacts with the idea of people and members living within it. The family is also linked to this notion of the household. What is the household? The anthropological study of the household has been very vast and very varied. However, the household remains a secondary focus and has remained a secondary focus to the idea of the family for a really long time. Interestingly, Janet Carsten has looked at the household as a specific space where memories are retained. In India, the household is a very complicated space of negotiation, and the household is usually linked to ideas of gender and again the domestic division of labor. The household is also occupied mostly by women. In Rajni Palriwala's study of negotiating patrilineal, she looks at how women in rural Rajasthan negotiate with their position in the household and how they think through their roles within a joint setup. This is particularly important to understand that the family and the household are gendered spaces as well, where rights, obligations and duties are unequally distributed. The family, like any other space in society, is not an egalitarian space. It inhabits and works through power dynamics and particular privilege and disprivilege that members share in. In that sense, Palriwala's study of the Sikar district in Rajasthan looks at how women negotiate their place in a largely unequal, asymmetric society. The household in Rajasthan becomes very important to understand consumption. food, consumption are important spaces where the family comes together. We will see in the lecture on relatedness in the next lecture that feeding and eating together are important ways in which the family relates to each other. However, the act of cooking, feeding, eating is also a female act in the household, in the patrilineage at least. Palriwala finds Rajasthani women negotiating in different ways. There are certain important features of the Rajasthani household that she outlines in terms of consumption. But before she does so, she discusses how changing economic processes are impacting how we think of the household and the family. This is important to know and understand how we think of our own families as well. Thus, in Rajasthan, she identifies certain important structural features of the household in Sikar. One of the most important is that the social world of the household is an important space to negotiate with. The household is not just a household in itself, it is also linked to other people around it, what is known as the Bag Vibhag Walo. Here, the Bag Vibhag Walo are your neighbors, your extended family, your distant kin, the people you work with, your clients and your patrons, and people who come to work with you. A household is not just an amalgamation of key members, but everyone else within it as well. And people who do not belong to the household, but with whom the household interacts with. The vegetable seller, the maid, the domestic help, the cleaners, everybody are part of the construction of a household. In Rajasthan, therefore, patrilineage or patrilineage means that the focus of the household is on men and on the sons they reproduce. The women become part of this household as in-marrying wives and as women who will be married out of the household. Within such a structure, women usually have to report to 3 other people over them. The first, the immediate superior is the senior woman, a mother-in-law, an older sister-in-law, or if you're the junior most woman in the household, it can be also a married sister-in-law or an unmarried sister-in-law. The other is the husband. The woman has to report to her husband and seek his consent. And the highest in the authority structure that a woman must adhere to is the head of the household. Ideally, in a patrilineal household, the head is usually a man. And in such situations, the division of labor and authority and power, as mentioned before, is centered on the man. So the head of the household might have different kinds of dynamics operating with the women of the household. The women of the household continue to be very important in terms of food and consumption. However, it is mediated through power and authority that the head of the household exercises. Therefore, in terms of the dynamics of food consumption that the household undertakes, there are certain important structural cleavages that happen. The first is that usually the women control the food stock of the household, agricultural produce that they make for themselves. However, if a senior woman, usually a mother-in-law or an older woman might be missing from the equation, the head of the household, the male head of the household takes over the stock, the grain stock, to ensure equitable distribution. Here there is a lack of trust for junior kinswomen who might not equitably distribute food. This points towards how the family dynamics of power and hierarchy operates in very different ways and how they are interesting in the way in which we think of familial structures. Similarly, the other structural problem that the household might throw up is this notion of how commercialization of agricultural produce has led to men buying food and bringing it to the household. When men buy food and bring to the household, women lose more control over consumption and food distribution. This means an added layer is added to their dynamics of producing food and distributing it amongst family members. This has meant also that agricultural produce that the family made are now increasingly controlling not only supply of food but also the demand itself. Men demand more food and then they supply it, diminishing and decreasing the role of women in deciding consumption of food items. The other political structural cleavage that happens within the family in the act of food consumption is when serving of food becomes an important avenue for women to exercise their agency. Serving of food in Sikar district in Rajasthan, according to Palriwala, is something that only women do. If women are serving food, they also decide who gets what and how much. We never would have thought of serving of food being such a political and important aspect of the family, but the serving of food is also an act of patronage and favoritism. A woman might end up giving more food to someone she favors and less food to someone she doesn't favor. But this is not based on individual choices alone. This is also based on familial diktats and who should get more food and who should not get more food. So, rules and laws actually define a woman's act of giving food to her family members. This is particularly interesting when seen in relation to how family members consume the food that is served. If you remember from your own familial setup, the food served by women is often served first to the male heads of the household. The male head of the household, the next generational head, and so on and so forth. At the end, in many patrilineage households, women get to eat the food. The server gets to eat at the very end. She may not get the entire food, but might get some dregs. This is, of course, an ideal typical representation that we also find in popular cinema and images of serving and eating. But what is of importance here is that the act of serving itself carries various different kinds of power and authorial structures. So, Palriwala finds that more servings go to those members of the family who contribute monetarily more. Servings also go more to children, younger children, and amongst children to sons. Here, women act out a very important trajectory. They favor sons who they know will protect them as they age. So, mothers will feed their younger sons more food surreptitiously or openly to curry favor for future support and financial help. This may also happen in many cases when the son is an expat and returns from abroad to stay at home. The mother might pile on the food for this son to seek his support and help monetarily. These kinds of maneuverings and negotiations are important in the way in which women constantly fight back when faced with lesser rights or positions within the household or family. These are things that one cannot exclude from a conceptualization of the family. Food, consumption, serving are important ways in which the family thinks and believes and lives within the setup. The other thing that becomes very important is the way in which women negotiate their financial powers within the household. In the absence of access to cash or money from the male members of the household, many women in Palriwala's study barter goods when in times of need or necessity. They may keep away some amount of ration, items of clothing or other things to barter for essential items. In North India, for a long time, the practice of the Bartanwali was a very popular mode of bartering for women of the household. A local village woman would come to sell steel utensils to women, to housewives in exchange of old clothing. Many young housewives would keep away or stock old clothing and shoes and then barter them for essential utensils which they needed in the kitchen, for which they wouldn't necessarily have money or would be given money to buy. This was an effective way of creating space and agency to buy with their own buying power. Bartering becomes also a very important way in which debt is created in an informal economy with women. One of the things that microfinance had invested in was this power that women had of bartering resources and saving money. One of the things that microfinance banks developed was the power in which local communities of women could invest together and barter for greater good and savings. This is what led to the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh winning the Nobel Prize for Peace. But the interesting imagination behind microfinance was this ability of women to barter and save for essential requirements of the household or for a rainy day. Many of our mothers who were housewives used to keep away a small amount of their household expenses for future use at times of emergency. This was a particular way in which women negotiated their space in a complex household where access to goods was problematic or difficult. Another reason that Palriwala suggests is that where the play of age and gender becomes very important in household consumption. So, for instance, senior members of the household, especially widowed mothers who are not in the position of headship anymore, may lose out on consumption and might be at loggerheads with the junior members of the household because they are on limited time or on borrowed time. There may be a lot of conflict in the household and mistreatment of the elderly as they consume precious resources of the household meant for more younger members or more productive members of the family. This again becomes a huge flashpoint for women in the family, leading to conflict amongst themselves, and which is how patrilineal thrives in its unequal form when women actually come to loggerheads about each other's resource sharing. So, elderly relatives, both men and women who are past their prime in authority, may be relegated to the fringes of the household again. Just like, as mentioned earlier in the past lecture, widowed women are pushed to the fringes. They are a liability and pose a huge problem to the collective household economy. This leads to conflict also in terms of the other important segment of the household, which are daughters. In India, studies suggest that traditionally daughters get less nutrition in households, which means that they are brought up weak, anemic, and have future health issues, because sons are favored in how the household sharing of food is undertaken. This is important because if the woman is the primary server in the household, she is constantly reproducing this kind of inequality in serving her son more food and her daughter less food. Part of the logic of how the daughter is going to stay in her natal family for a little time, this form of inequality is constantly reproduced over generations. However, Palriwala interestingly found in her study that most households actually wanted to invest in their daughter's health. They thought that once the daughter would get married, she would anyway get less food in her conjugal family, making it imperative that while she lives with her parents, she should be well fed and well taken care of. However, in reality, this is something that women wanted to do for their daughters but were not allowed to do, because ultimately resources were shared through the men or through the male heads, therefore structurally favoring the boys. So the younger sons and nephews would demand for more, and the women who served the food would have to fall into the trap of giving them more food as per the structural power and authority. So gender and age worked in very negative ways to how this form of sharing could be constructed. This is also interesting in the ways in which Palriwala found that negotiating with patrilineal may or may not happen to the advantage of the women in the household. The only time it became advantageous was when men migrated out of the household. Many times men migrated from rural areas of Rajasthan to work in cities, leaving behind their wives to live with the joint household and negotiate with it. Here the man would send money either to the head of the household or in many cases to his wife in particular. And the wife had to negotiate the spending of the money within the household. Here there was a lot of space for negotiation, as Palriwala found. She found that many women were able to bypass their husband's decision or authority regarding the spending of the money to be able to spend it or invest it in the ways they thought were correct. She found especially that amongst the Pathans of Sikar, if the husband had traveled to the Middle East and was working there, women had more power to take decisions effectively. Because of the distance between the husband and the wife, both spatial and temporal, the woman was able to take a spot decision and worry about its consequences later. Later meaning the consequences, the husband would have forgot about her decision and would have glossed over it. Here, Palriwala also found that Muslim Pathan women in Sikar had more power in decision making than the Hindu Jat women, because they also had rights in their father's property. Structural conditionality of inheritance, income and household expenses come together in making women's position in their conjugal household much more easier in terms of decision making. The migrant husband facilitates larger leeway and more power to the woman. Similarly, if the woman is able to move out of the joint household to join her husband in the city, it adds to her freedom. Nimkoff finds that most of Indian women who live in nuclear households away from their conjugal households with their husbands in cities were able to effectively take decisions in favor of their children and themselves without the fear of a backlash from the larger joint household head. This worked in the favor of women better in negotiating with patrilineal. The idea of the household is not restricted only to certain ideas or social constructions of what joint household consists of, also means looking at these dynamics of age, gender, and invoking them when looking at what makes joint families. The notion of the household, interestingly, is dependent on how women negotiate with it. And for a long time, in looking at the joint family, we are unable to actually provoke the thought of how the household fits into it and brings in more nuance. Thus, in a study by Shastri in the 1990s, in a comparative analysis of the Indian household and the American household, Shastri finds that there is larger dissatisfaction amongst the American woman living in a love marriage nuclear household because of the lack of fulfillment of personal desires. This is very particular because in the 1990s, Shastri finds that Indian women and men are easily accommodative in their marriage and in their living cohabitation rights within a joint household, whereas American women feel unfulfilled in a nuclear setup with their husband and children. Children also become a liability in the pursuit of personal goals. Whereas in India too, women find that the lack of autonomy, in economic autonomy in having a job outside the home can be a difficult choice for Indian women, where they're stuck at home with no economic independence while their husband forge out. This is a very important intervention in looking at the household and the economy, because the joint family and the household are linked through how economic rights are shared within it. So for Indian women in today's India, working outside the home has become a very important way to negotiate their own sense of self and rights to the household. Bringing in income to the household has also given a lot of urban women equal stature in the household. That does not mean that women in rural areas don't work. They do. In Palriwala's study, many of the women did household agricultural labor and daily wage labor, but unfortunately did not have the same rights within the household. They would bring back the money and deposit it in the familial coffer, again adding to another source of inequality because they had no personal expenditure to fall back on. This is critical in how we understand that even monetary wealth or power does not always, income does not always translate into power within the household. It is negotiated at various levels. Contemporary studies of household economies are now increasingly looking at how the family or the question of the joint family is becoming redundant in case of India. We are not looking at how joint families are constructed, but at how households come to compose themselves and what forms of compositions and relationships make up the household. Therefore, in recent analysis and research by Japanese scholars Yumiko Tokita Tanabe and Yoko Taguchi, the idea of newer household configurations is coming into being. Yoko Taguchi, for instance, looks at the urban single nuclear household in Mumbai and finds that within this household, servants also play a very important part in constructing or looking at how people come together. Live-in servants especially take care of children and aging parents and become part of the household and family by default. Yumiko Tokita Tanabe and Preeti Ramamurthy look at how single women households are becoming an emerging trend in urban India as they break away from their own familial units to earn money and stay in urban areas and form a single woman household or many single women living together in a household. These are particular new configurations which mark a changing sense of household and family in India, which is not restricted only to the idea of the joint family. On that note, we will proceed to the next lecture. See you soon. Thank you.